1403. Paris, the Châtelet prison. The first sensation is the cold, a penetrating chill that seems to rise from the very stones of the earth, a dampness that clings to the skin and promises decay. It is a cold that has nothing to do with winter and everything to do with despair. The air is a thick, foul tapestry woven from the stench of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, and the ever-present, cloying sweetness of human waste mingling with wet straw. In the oppressive dark, broken only by the flickering, greasy light of a single torch held by a guard, sounds become predators. The frantic, unseen scuttling of rats in the walls, the steady, maddening drip of water from a sweating ceiling, and far down the corridor, the rhythmic, muffled sobbing of a man that occasionally sharpens into a high, piercing scream before subsiding again into misery. This is the symphony of the Châtelet, the royal fortress turned charnel house, and into this sensory hell another sound intrudes, formal and chillingly indifferent, the voice of a clerk, dry as dust, reading from a scroll of parchment. The words are heavy with Latinate legalisms, but their meaning is as sharp and brutal as a headsman's axe. Conspiracy and demonic pact, witchcraft and malevolent arts, for the procurement of divers poisons and substances, with the express intent to bring about the death of our sovereign lord, the Dauphin. The voice drones on, but one word, one name, spoken with a contemptuous flourish, cuts through the miasma of fear. Medea. It hangs in the air, a brand of pure fire. The woman chained to the wall, Jeanne de Clavicul, lifts her head. Her face is a mask of grime and exhaustion, but in her eyes, a flicker of something. Not just terror, but the cold fury of a brilliant mind witnessing the perverse theater of its own destruction. She, who had commanded alembics and retorts, who understood the subtle chemistry of metals and herbs, is now being remade into a mythological monster. This is not a trial, it is an exorcism. They are not accusing a woman, they are casting out a demon of their own making. This was the moment her saga was truly born, not in a laboratory, but here in the stinking darkness, where a name became her eternal cage. This is the narrative of her, the woman they called the French Medea. This was the saga of Jeanne de Clavicul, a name history has all but forgotten, deliberately overshadowed by the monstrous epithet stapled to her soul. To understand this woman, we must journey back into the world that created and then devoured her, a world of glittering courts and shadowy plots, a world where science was indistinguishable from sorcery. We must confront the central, agonizing paradox of her existence. How did a woman celebrated for her intellect, a savante and alchemist sought after by the highest powers in the kingdom, become the embodiment of unnatural, child-killing evil? What terrible act, real or imagined, could warrant such a transformation? This is the core question that coils like a serpent around her legacy. Was she a cold-blooded assassin? A monster who used her knowledge to plot the murder of a child prince? Or was she a pawn, a brilliant but powerless woman caught in the grinding gears of a dynastic struggle, a convenient scapegoat whose condemnation served a higher political purpose? To answer this, we cannot simply look at the charges read in that stinking cell. We must dissect the very soul of her time, an age of profound anxiety, where the line between miracle and heresy, between a healing elixir and a deadly poison, was as thin as a razor's edge. Her story is not just about guilt or innocence. It is about the deadly gravity of power and the way history is forged, not in the pursuit of truth, but in the crucible of accusation. The legend of the French Medea is a grand and terrible tapestry, and we must pull on every thread to reveal the true face of the woman hidden behind the monster's mask. To understand this woman, we must first understand the world that spawned her, a world teetering on the brink of madness. This was France at the turn of the 15th century, a kingdom not whole, but a fractured, bleeding thing. The great steel avalanche of the 100 Years' War against England had been grinding on for generations, a seemingly endless cycle of brutal raids, catastrophic defeats, and Pyrrhic victories that had bled the nobility and savaged the countryside. The land itself seemed to groan under the weight of this perpetual conflict. But the true sickness was not on the battlefields of Aquitaine. It was in the very heart of the kingdom, in the mind of its king. Charles VI, once called the Beloved, was now known as the Mad. He was a monarch adrift on a terrifying sea of psychosis, his lucid moments becoming fewer and farther between. In his madness, he would not recognize his own wife, would believe his enemies were hiding in the tapestries, and, most famously, would suffer from the delusion that he was made of glass, screaming that no one should touch him lest he shatter into 1,000 pieces. This royal madness created a vacuum, a void at the center of power that by the laws of nature and politics had to be filled. And into that void stepped two titans, two ravenous wolves of the royal bloodline, the king's younger brother, Louis, Duke of Orléans, and his cousin, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. Louis was a man of culture, a patron of the arts, charming and decadent, but possessed of a rapier-sharp political ambition. John was his opposite, grim, pious, a warrior who cultivated an image of being a man of the people and utterly, unforgivingly ruthless. Their rivalry was not merely political, it was a visceral, personal hatred that poisoned the entire court and split the kingdom into two warring factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. In this climate of endemic warfare, political instability and a hollow crown, paranoia was the air everyone breathed. Allegiances shifted like sand, and poison became the preferred tool of statecraft. It was silent, deniable, and terrifyingly effective. This was the chessboard upon which Jeanne de Clavicul would be placed, a world that did not just allow for a figure like the French Medea, it demanded one. Who was this woman? Before the court, before the laboratory, before the legend. The chronicles, written by her enemies, are deliberately silent on her origins, as if she sprang fully formed from a witch's cauldron. But the truth, as always, is buried deeper. This was the saga of a mind forged in obscurity, a woman who had to claw her way to knowledge in a world designed to keep it from her. Jeanne de Clavicul was not born to power. She was a commoner. Perhaps she was the daughter of an apothecary in Paris, growing up amongst the pungent smells of dried herbs, mineral salts, and strange tinctures, learning the properties of belladonna and arsenic alongside those of lavender and rose. Or maybe she was the prodigy of a renegade scholar from the great universities of the South, places like Montpellier or Salerno, where the medical and alchemical knowledge of the Arab world still flowed, a world away from the rigid theology of the Sorbonne. To acquire her skills in metallurgy, distillation, pharmacology, and the cryptic arts of alchemy was, for a woman of the 14th century, a revolutionary act. It required a fierce, almost monastic devotion, a secret life of study, poring over forbidden manuscripts by candlelight, learning the coded language of the alchemists, the green lion, the red king, the celestial marriage of sulfur and mercury. This clandestine education would have forged her character. She would have learned to be secretive, to mask her intelligence, to present a carefully constructed face to the world. She would have understood from a young age that her knowledge was both a treasure and a terrible danger. It set her apart, made her powerful, but it also made her an object of profound suspicion. In an age that believed devoutly in the supernatural, a woman who could turn lead into a golden-hued alloy or distill a colorless liquid that could mimic the effects of a sudden fever was walking a tightrope between being seen as a genius and being condemned as a witch. This was her ancestral curse, the burden of a brilliant mind in a superstitious age. Her first step into the great game, her arrival in the serpent's nest of the French court, was not a grand entrance, but a subtle infiltration. She did not arrive as a lady of noble birth, with a retinue and a pedigree. She came as a rumor, a whisper of a woman with extraordinary talents, a savante whose skills might prove useful. In the paranoid, faction-ridden world surrounding the mad King Charles VII, unique assets were hoarded like gold. Perhaps she was first introduced through a lady-in-waiting to the Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, demonstrating a talent for creating exotic perfumes or rare pigments for illuminated manuscripts. Or maybe she caught the eye of a court physician, astounding him with a knowledge of herbal remedies that surpassed his own. Her intellect was her currency, and it was a coin with two faces. On one side, she was a source of endless fascination. In a court obsessed with novelty and luxury, her ability to perform minor alchemical transmutations, to create glittering cosmetics, or to speak with authority on the properties of stones and stars, made her an exotic curiosity, a living grimoire. But on the other side, that same intellect bred suspicion. She was an anomaly, a woman who had usurped a man's domain of learning. The courtiers, steeped in a rigid social hierarchy, would have looked at her with a mixture of awe and contempt. She was not one of them. She was a tool, a strange and potentially dangerous instrument to be picked up and used by the powerful. She understood this calculus perfectly. Her survival depended on making herself indispensable. She had to prove that her knowledge was not just for show, but that it could serve the ambitions of a great lord. It was a perilous game of demonstrating just enough of her power to be valued, but not so much as to be feared as a sorceress. Her entry into this world was the first click of a lock, sealing her into a gilded cage from which there would be no escape. Every great ambition is fueled by a secret fire, an inner demon that whispers in the dark of night. For Jeanne de Clavicul, what was this hidden motivation? The historical record, tainted as it is, offers no easy answer, forcing us to reconstruct her soul from the shadows she cast. Was her driving force a pure, unadulterated thirst for knowledge? In this view, she was a true natural philosopher, born into the wrong century, a mind akin to Leonardo's, trapped in an age of superstition. She saw alchemy not as black magic, but as the key to unlocking the very secrets of God's creation, the magnum opus, the great work. Her laboratory was her cathedral, her alembics and crucibles, the sacred vessels of her faith. The court was merely a means to an end, a source of patronage that would allow her to continue her holy, secret quest for the philosopher's stone. If this was her demon, it was the demon of intellectual pride, a hubris that made her believe she could traffic with princes and their sordid affairs without being stained by them. Or perhaps her motivation was something more visceral, a burning desire for power and influence in a world that had granted her none by birth. As a woman and a commoner, every door was closed to her: the church, the army, the government. These were the exclusive domains of men. But through her esoteric knowledge, she found a back door to the chambers of power. When a duke wanted a potion to ensure his wife conceived a son, or a courtier desired a tincture to win the love of a lady, they came to her. In those moments, she, Jeanne the Commoner, held power over the greatest men in the land. This was a heady, addictive brew, and perhaps she became intoxicated by it, the secret master of her supposed masters. A third, and perhaps more tragic possibility, is that her demon was simply the cold, pragmatic need to survive. She may have been a woman alone, without family or protection, whose unique skills were her only shield against a brutal world. She monetized the forbidden because it was the only trade that offered her security and a roof over her head. She gave the court what it wanted: potions, poisons, secrets, not out of ambition, but out of desperation. Whatever its true nature, this inner fire was her most closely guarded alchemical secret, the invisible force that propelled her ever deeper into the heart of the labyrinth, towards a center where triumph and annihilation were one and the same. In the treacherous ecosystem of the royal court, survival depended on finding a powerful protector, a titan whose shadow could shield one from the lesser predators. For Jeanne de Clavicul, this fateful alliance came in the form of Louis, Duke of Orléans, the king's own brother. This encounter would define her path, elevate her to heights she could never have imagined, and ultimately doom her to the pyre. Louis was everything his rival, John of Burgundy, was not. He was a Renaissance prince before the Renaissance had truly dawned in France, a man of exquisite taste, a poet, a collector of rare manuscripts, and a lavish patron of the arts. He was also a man of insatiable appetites, for power, for wealth, and for women. His charm was said to be legendary, a silken glove hiding a fist of iron ambition. To a woman like Jeanne, a scholar who likely felt her intellect was wasted on brutish nobles, Louis must have seemed a kindred spirit. He would not have seen her merely as a witch or a hedge wizard. He would have recognized the sophistication of her knowledge. He would have been fascinated by her understanding of chemistry, her ability to engage in discussions of philosophy, her mastery of a secret world. He gave her what no one else could: legitimacy. Under his patronage, she was no longer just a clever commoner. She was the alchemist of the Duke of Orléans, a formal position that came with a laboratory, access to rare materials, and a status that commanded respect, or at least a grudging deference. But this alliance was a Faustian bargain. In exchange for his protection and resources, she became his creature, her destiny irrevocably shackled to his. Louis's ambition was a blazing sun that nourished her, but it also cast a long, dark shadow. His enemies became her enemies. His quarrels became her quarrels. She, the woman of science and secrets, was now a piece, albeit a powerful one, in his ruthless game for control of the French crown. She had found her great patron, but in doing so, she had placed a collar around her own neck, the leash of which was held by the most charming and dangerous man in France. The first steps up the ladder of power are rarely taken with grand, heroic leaps. They are made through a series of small, quiet compromises in the shadows. For Jeanne, now installed under the patronage of the Duke of Orléans, the price of her new position was to turn her knowledge toward the practical needs of power politics. The requests from her patron would have started innocuously, blurring the line between science and the dark arts. It was not yet a demand for outright poison. Instead, it was a whisper for a sleeping draught, a powerful one, to be administered to a rival's guard. It was a request for a love potion, a concoction designed not to inspire genuine affection, but to lower the inhibitions of a court lady from whom the Duke wished to extract secrets. She might have been tasked with creating disfiguring cosmetics, powders that would cause a temporary but hideous rash on the face of a rival duchess, humiliating her before the court. These were the whispers in the laboratory, the slow poisoning of her own soul. Each task was a moral concession, justified in the name of loyalty or self-preservation. She was serving her patron, ensuring her own survival. Furthermore, her laboratory became a hub for intelligence. Her need for rare substances, mercury from Spain, antimony from the German lands, exotic herbs from the Levant, put her in contact with a network of merchants, apothecaries, and smugglers, people who moved in the city's underbelly and heard the secrets of the powerful. She became the Duke's spy master of secrets, reporting on the whispers she gathered along with her chemicals. The chroniclers of the time, hostile to her, would later paint these acts as pure sorcery. But for Jeanne, it was likely a terrifying and exhilarating calculus of power. She was making herself indispensable, weaving a web of dependence around the Duke. He needed her skills, her secrets, her concoctions. She was no longer just a protected artist. She was becoming a weapon. And the price of that power was the slow, steady erosion of the line between healing and harming, between alchemy and assassination. To understand the tragedy of Jeanne de Clavicul, one must understand the man who was the gravitational center of the hatred that destroyed her. John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. He was the antagonist on the macro level, the embodiment of the forces arrayed against her patron, and therefore against her. If Louis of Orléans was a silken rapier, all elegance and deadly precision, John was a spiked war mace, brutal, direct, and devastatingly effective. He cultivated an image that was the polar opposite of his cousin's. While Louis held decadent masked balls, John presented himself as a pious, sober defender of the common man and the public good, a stark contrast that won him immense popularity among the merchants and citizens of Paris. He was a seasoned warrior, having earned his moniker, the Fearless, on a disastrous crusade against the Ottoman Turks at Nicopolis, where his rash bravery led to a Christian catastrophe, but cemented his personal legend. He saw Louis's influence over the Mad King and his rumored affair with Queen Isabeau, not just as a political threat, but as a moral stain on the kingdom, a decadent rot that he, John, was destined to excise. The feud between them was the central drama of the French court, a cancer that metastasized, spreading into every aspect of governance. It was a conflict of style and substance. Orléans' extravagant spending versus Burgundy's supposed fiscal prudence. Orléans' cunning diplomacy versus Burgundy's blunt militarism. They fought for control over the treasury, for the right to raise taxes, and most importantly, for the guardianship of the royal children, particularly the Dauphin, the heir to the throne. Whoever controlled the next king would control the future of France. In this titanic struggle, Jeanne de Clavicul, the alchemist of Orléans, was seen by the Burgundian faction not as a scholar, but as the embodiment of everything they despised about their rivals. She was secretive, foreign to the norms of the court, and a purveyor of unnatural arts. She was a symbol of the poison, both literal and metaphorical, that they believed was corrupting the kingdom from within. John the Fearless was not just her patron's enemy, he was her ideological nemesis, and his rise was the storm cloud gathering on her horizon. In the world of the court, where perception is reality, a single failure can be more devastating than 1,000 successes. For Jeanne, the psychological breaking point, the first fatal miscalculation, likely came not from a failed poison plot, but from a failed attempt at a miracle. The stage was the king's private chambers, a space filled with a dread that no guards could dispel. Charles VI was in the throes of one of his most terrifying delusions. He believed he was made of glass. He sat rigid, refusing to move, his eyes wide with terror, convinced that the slightest touch would cause him to shatter into 1,000,000 fragments. He wore clothes reinforced with iron ribs to protect his fragile form. The royal physicians, with their bleedings and arcane potions based on the theory of humors, were utterly helpless. They were men of books, and their books had no answer for a soul that had broken. In this moment of supreme crisis, with the kingdom's stability hanging by the thread of the king's sanity, a desperate Duke of Orléans might have turned to his secret weapon, his alchemist. He would have brought Jeanne into that chamber of horrors, commissioning her not to kill, but to heal. It was the ultimate test of her esoteric knowledge. She, who understood the hidden sympathies of nature, was tasked with mending a mind that had come unbound. She would have brought her distillations, her carefully prepared tinctures, perhaps burning incense meant to calm the spirits. But against the profound depths of the king's psychosis, her science was as useless as the physician's superstitions. Her failure would have been absolute and public. In the eyes of her enemies, particularly the pious Burgundian faction, this was proof. She was not a healer. She was a charlatan. Or worse, her arts were demonic in origin, and their failure to cure the divinely appointed king was a sign of her malevolence. For Jeanne herself, this moment would have been a terrifying revelation. She had believed her intellect could solve any puzzle, but she had come face to face with a mystery she could not distill in her retorts. She understood then that her position was not built on a foundation of respect for her knowledge, but on the shifting sands of her patron's power and her ability to produce results. And when she failed, she was not just fallible, she was exposed. Chaos is a ladder, and in the decaying kingdom of France, the rungs were made of fear and suspicion. As the feud between the houses of Orléans and Burgundy escalated from courtly intrigue to open threats and armed retinues clashing in the streets of Paris, the entire social fabric began to unravel. This was the Armagnac-Burgundian gambit, a slow-motion civil war played out in the shadow of the English threat. In this atmosphere of escalating paranoia, Jeanne's unique and dangerous skills became more valuable and more perilous than ever before. The world was no longer one of subtle potions and intellectual curiosities. It was a brutal, zero-sum game of survival. Her laboratory, once a place of quasi-scientific inquiry, transformed into the clandestine nerve center of the Orléans faction's shadow war. The fear of poison, once a distant threat, was now a daily reality. Great lords hired food tasters, slept in locked chambers, and looked at their closest relatives with suspicion. Every sudden illness, every untimely death, was presumed to be murder until proven otherwise. In this environment, Jeanne's reputation, even if unearned at this stage, was a weapon in itself. The mere knowledge that the Duke of Orléans had a master of toxins in his employ was enough to strike fear into his enemies. Conversely, her existence gave the Burgundian faction a perfect target for their propaganda. They could paint the entire Orléans court as decadent, impious sorcerers, with Jeanne as their high priestess of evil. For Jeanne, this chaos was an opportunity to solidify her importance. She would have been tasked with creating antidotes, both real and imagined, to protect the Duke. She would have been called to examine the bodies of those who died suddenly, to pronounce whether their deaths were natural or the result of a Burgundian plot. She had transitioned from a scholar into a political operative, a spy master dealing in the currency of fear. The chaos that engulfed the kingdom was the forge in which her reputation as a poisoner was truly hammered into shape, long before she may have ever touched a vial with murderous intent. There must have been a moment, a peak, when Jeanne de Clavicul felt she was not just a survivor, but a queen in her own shadowy kingdom. This was her greatest triumph, the apex of her power, an elixir of influence more potent than any she could distill in her laboratory. She had become indispensable to Louis of Orléans, one of the most powerful men in Europe. Her counsel was sought not only on matters of alchemy, but on politics and strategy. She was the keeper of his darkest secrets, the one person who understood the intricate web of fears, ambitions, and dependencies that held his faction together. Her laboratory, funded lavishly by the ducal treasury, was a testament to her status. A state-of-the-art facility filled with rare glass from Venice, precision instruments from Germany, and a library of manuscripts that would be the envy of any scholar. In a society rigidly defined by bloodline and feudal rank, her ascent was a miracle of intellect. She, a commoner, a woman, moved with confidence in the highest circles. Dukes and duchesses would visit her, not as a spectacle, but as supplicants, seeking her remedies, her advice, her secrets. She held their lives in her hands in more ways than one. She knew who was unfaithful, who was in debt, who feared a rival's rise. This was a power far greater than that of any noble lady confined to her embroidery and courtly gossip. She was a player in the great game, a master of the shadows. This triumph was not marked by a public ceremony or a grant of lands, but by the quiet, terrified respect in the eyes of her enemies and the absolute trust in the eyes of her patron. She had achieved what was thought impossible. She had transcended her birth and her gender, creating a unique nexus of power based entirely on the force of her own mind. In these moments, she must have felt invincible, the master of her own destiny, the alchemist who had successfully transmuted the base metal of her origins into the pure gold of influence. To be at the summit of a mountain is to be closest to the lightning. In her moment of greatest triumph, Jeanne would have been gripped by the psychology of that peak, the particular form of pride the Greeks called hubris. She would not have seen herself as a sinner, a witch, or a poisoner. In the quiet of her laboratory, surrounded by the elegant logic of her instruments, she would have seen herself as a scientist, a philosophe who stood above the brutish, superstitious men who governed the world. They, with their clumsy wars and brutish assassinations, were practitioners of chaos. She, on the other hand, was a master of order, of the natural laws that governed the universe. She understood that the same plant that could yield a medicine to calm a fever could, with a different preparation, yield a substance to stop a heart. This was not evil, it was knowledge. She likely viewed the political intrigues of the court with a kind of intellectual detachment, a grand chemical experiment where she was merely adjusting the variables. She saw the dukes and princes not as her moral superiors, but as volatile elements, powerful but predictable, whose reactions she could control and direct for the benefit of her patron, and by extension, herself. This was the hubris of the savante. She believed her intelligence was a shield, that she was clever enough to handle these dangerous men, to play their game without being consumed by it. She saw her work not as a series of moral compromises, but as a pragmatic application of her art. She was the rational mind in a world of savage impulse. This belief in her own exceptionalism, in her ability to control the immense and violent forces she was meddling with, was the tragic flaw that would lead directly to her ruin. She forgot the first rule of alchemy. Some substances are so volatile that they transform not only the materials in the crucible, but also the alchemist who dares to handle them. The great forces of history are often just the amplification of intensely personal hatreds. The conflict that would consume Jeanne was not an abstract political struggle, but a duel of shadows between two men. Her patron, Louis of Orléans, and his sworn enemy, John the Fearless. To understand her fate, we must zoom in on the chemistry of their personal animosity, a toxic brew of jealousy, ambition, and familial betrayal. They were cousins, princes of the blood, but they could not have been more different. Louis was the peacock, dazzling the court with his wit, his poetry, and his scandalous affairs. He was a man who lived publicly, his every move a piece of theater. John was the spider, weaving his webs in the shadows, cultivating an aura of austerity and danger. Their rivalry played out in 1,000 petty and profound ways. They would publicly insult each other before the royal council, with Louis mocking John's military failures and John condemning Louis's decadent spending of state funds. They competed for symbolic honors, for precedence in royal processions, for the ear of the mad king during his brief moments of lucidity. The most poisonous element of their feud, however, was the rumor that haunted the court, that Louis of Orléans was the lover of the queen, Isabeau of Bavaria. This was not just a personal scandal. It was an act of treason that cast doubt on the legitimacy of the royal children, including the Dauphin. For John the Fearless, who positioned himself as the defender of the kingdom's honor, this was an unforgivable sin. The personal drama became a political firestorm. Their conflict was a vortex, pulling everyone at court into its spin. Jeanne de Clavicul was not a disinterested observer. She was at the very epicenter. As Louis's confidant and secret weapon, she was inextricably linked to his cause. The hatred John felt for Louis extended to all his instruments, and he would have seen Jeanne as the most unnatural and dangerous of them all, the witch behind the debauched prince, the architect of his poisonously charming schemes. What precisely did Jeanne do in that laboratory, that space of both miracle and menace? To her accusers, it was a devil's workshop, a place where she boiled toads and spiders to brew potions that could kill a man at 100 paces. But the reality was likely a fascinating and dangerous duality, a perfect reflection of the age itself. This was the saga of the Philosopher's Stone and the Poisoner's Vial, two quests that were, in the alchemical mind, intimately related. On one hand, she was a genuine proto-scientist. Her daily work would have involved the meticulous, painstaking processes of classical alchemy. She would have spent countless hours at the forge, attempting to perfect the process of cupellation to separate silver and gold from lead, a vital skill for a duke who always needed more money. She would have worked with alembics and retorts, mastering the art of distillation to create potent spirits, perfumes, and, most importantly, medicines. The aqua vitae, or water of life, which was believed to be a universal panacea. She would have ground minerals to create rare and vibrant pigments for the artists and manuscript illuminators her patron supported. This was the legitimate, scholarly side of her work, the pursuit of knowledge and beauty. But there was another, darker side to her library and her garden. The same knowledge of distillation that could produce a healing elixir could also be used to concentrate the toxins from plants like wolfsbane, hemlock, or deadly nightshade. Her understanding of metallurgy and mineral salts would have given her a deep familiarity with the properties of arsenic and antimony, the colorless, odorless inheritance powders of the age. The line between creating a medicine and a poison was not one of chemistry, but of dosage and intent. In a court where her patron was surrounded by enemies, the study of these substances would not have been an abstract hobby. It would have been a crucial part of her duties, a form of defensive research. She had to understand what might be used against her duke, and in doing so, she became a master of the very arts her enemies would accuse her of practicing. Her laboratory was a place of schizophrenia, a space where the noble quest for the Philosopher's Stone shared a bench with the grim reality of the Poisoner's Vial. Into this volatile chemical equation, a new and desperate element was added: the Queen, Isabeau of Bavaria. Her plight represents the first deep cracks in the facade of the Orléans faction's power, the harbingers of the coming storm. Isabeau was a woman in an impossible position. She was a foreigner, a German princess in the French court, and was viewed with suspicion from the day she arrived. With her husband, the king, lost to madness, she was the regent of a fragmenting kingdom, a queen without a king's authority. She fought desperately to maintain her influence and, most importantly, to protect her children from the predatory ambitions of the royal dukes. Her tragedy was that to survive, she had to choose a side, and she chose her husband's brother, Louis of Orléans. This alliance, however, was a double-edged sword. It gave her a powerful protector, but it also fueled the most dangerous rumor of the age, that they were lovers, and that the Dauphin was not the king's son, but the bastard of Orléans. This accusation, spread relentlessly by Burgundian propagandists, was a political atom bomb. It threatened to delegitimize the entire royal line and plunge the kingdom into a full-blown war of succession. As the pressure mounted, Isabeau's desperation would have grown. She was a mother watching a wolf circle her children. It is in the crucible of this maternal terror and political desperation that the conditions for a fateful act are created. A desperate queen, fearing for her son's life and throne, might be driven to consider solutions that were once unthinkable. She might turn to the one person in her circle who possessed the knowledge to remove a threat, silently and permanently. The queen's desperation provided the context, the fertile ground of fear and high stakes, from which a plot to commit the ultimate crime could grow. The cracks in the political order were becoming a chasm, and Queen Isabeau, along with Jeanne de Clavicul, was standing perilously close to the edge. This is the moment the narrative pivots, the point of no return. This was the commission of Medea, the fateful act from which all else follows. It would not have been a grand, theatrical scene, but a quiet, furtive meeting in the dead of night. A hidden chamber in the palace, the air thick with the smell of beeswax candles and fear. Present are the key figures: a desperate Queen Isabeau, her powerful ally, and rumored lover Louis of Orléans, and their most trusted and secret instrument, Jeanne de Clavicul. The conversation would have been conducted in whispers, the words themselves tasting of treason. The target of their plot, the source of all their problems. Perhaps it was the great rival himself, John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. His removal would solve everything at a stroke, leaving the Orléans faction in complete control of the state. Or, in a far darker and more twisted scenario, one that would truly earn John her monstrous moniker, the target might have been the heir to the throne, the young Dauphin, Louis de Guyenne. Why? In the paranoid logic of a succession crisis, if the Dauphin's legitimacy was being questioned because of the Queen's affair with Orléans, his death could clear the path for a younger royal son whose paternity was not in doubt, thereby securing the throne for a child Isabeau and Orléans could control. This is the heart of the darkness. What was Jeanne's role? She was the expert, the one who could make it happen without a trace, a slow-acting poison administered over weeks that would mimic a natural illness, a single, fast-acting drop in a cup of wine. The psychology of her decision is the core of the tragedy. Did she agree out of unwavering loyalty to her patrons, the people who had raised her from obscurity? Was it ambition, the ultimate display of her power? Or was she coerced, threatened with exposure or death if she refused? For a woman who had built her life on logic and control, this decision was a plunge into the abyss. By agreeing, she was no longer a scientist or a scholar. She had accepted the commission, and in that moment, the alchemist became an assassin. The Rubicon had been crossed. Triumph in the world of shadows is silent and unseen. Catastrophe is loud, public, and absolute. The plot, so carefully conceived in the hushed tones of conspiracy, was a calamitous failure. This was John's greatest catastrophe, a miscalculation of chemistry or fate that proved infinitely more destructive than success ever could have been. There are two paths this disaster could have taken. The first is a failure of the science itself. The poison, so carefully prepared in her laboratory, was administered to the target. Let us say it was the Duke of Burgundy. But it was too weak, or the dose was too small. Instead of a sudden, fatal illness, it produced only violent sickness, a bout of vomiting and fever from which the Duke, with his robust constitution, recovered. The result was not a quiet death, but a very loud and public attempted murder. The Duke's physicians would have immediately suspected poison, and the Duke himself would have known exactly who was behind it. The second, and perhaps more likely scenario, is that the conspiracy was betrayed from within. A servant, a lady-in-waiting, someone privy to the secret, lost their nerve or was a Burgundian spy all along. The plot was discovered before the poison could even be administered. A guard would have found the vial, or a letter would have been intercepted. This outcome was even more devastating. It provided John the Fearless with something far more valuable than a dead rival. Proof. He now had a cast-iron justification for what he had wanted to do all along: destroy the House of Orléans. The failed concoction triggered an immediate political firestorm. Whispers turned into open accusations. The Orléans faction was thrown into chaos and terror. Their secret, venomous plot was now exposed to the light, and the glare was annihilating. For Jeanne de Clavicul, this was the moment the floor fell away from beneath her feet. Her laboratory, her sanctuary of knowledge, was now a crime scene. Her vials and retorts were not instruments of science, but evidence of treason and black magic. The catastrophe was absolute, and it had transformed her from a priceless asset into the single greatest liability her patrons possessed. In the brutal arithmetic of power, when a conspiracy fails, the first to be sacrificed are those with the least protection. This was the moment of collapse, the ultimate betrayal. For Jeanne de Clavicul, the patrons she had served, the powerful figures for whom she had risked everything, now saw her not as a loyal servant, but as the living embodiment of their crime. To save themselves, they had to destroy her. The Duke of Orléans and Queen Isabeau, faced with the irrefutable evidence of the plot and the incandescent fury of John the Fearless, did what the powerful have always done. They found a scapegoat, and Jeanne was the perfect candidate. She was a commoner, which meant she had no powerful family to avenge her. She was a woman, making her an easy target in a misogynistic world. And most damningly, she was the alchemist, the one who had physically created the means of the crime. Her arrest was not a matter of justice. It was a carefully calculated political maneuver. It was swift and brutal. The King's Guard, likely acting on the orders of the Burgundian-controlled provost of Paris, would have stormed her laboratory. There would be no polite request to accompany them. They would have burst in, shattering her precious glass instruments, overturning her furnaces, seizing her books and powders as evidence of witchcraft. She would have been dragged from her sanctuary, through the streets, subjected to the jeers and spittle of the Parisian mob, who had been fed Burgundian propaganda for years about the Orléans witch. Her powerful patrons remained silent. There was no intervention from the Duke, no word of protest from the Queen. Their silence was her death sentence. She had been their most secret weapon, and she had become their most public sacrifice. In the cold calculus of their survival, her life was a small and necessary price to pay. The collapse was total, and the betrayal was absolute. She was utterly and completely alone, facing the wrath of a kingdom, abandoned by the very people she had tried to empower. The trial of Jeanne de Clavicul was not a legal proceeding. It was a meticulously staged piece of political theater, and its stage was the torture chamber of the Châtelet. This was the theater of pain, a place designed not to uncover truth, but to produce a confession. The objective was simple: to transform Jeanne the Alchemist, a pawn in a political plot, into Medea the Witch, a monstrous demon who had acted alone out of pure, motiveless evil, thereby exonerating her high-born patrons. The sensory assault would have begun the moment she was led down the stone steps. The air grew colder, thick with the smell of damp stone, old fear, and the faint, coppery tang of dried blood. The only light came from a brazier, its coals glowing a hellish red, casting dancing shadows that made the instruments of torture seem alive. The rack, the strapado, the iron boot, they were not just tools. They were characters in this gruesome play. The questions put to her by the provost and his clerks would have been a masterpiece of psychological cruelty. They were not, "Did you do this?" but "How did you do it?" They did not ask if she was a witch. They asked her to name the demon with whom she had made her pact. They presented her with her own alchemical tools, a mortar and pestle, a glass vial, and demanded she explain how she used them to invoke Satan. When she refused, the application of pain would have begun. The slow, agonizing dislocation of the joints on the rack, the searing agony of hot irons applied to the skin. Under this relentless torment, the mind begins to break. Reality dissolves. The desperate animal need for the pain to stop overwhelms all else. And so, she would have begun to talk, her words a garbled mixture of truth, delirium, and the very suggestions her torturers were feeding her. Yes, she had made a pact with a demon named Asmodeus. Yes, she had flown on a broom to a sabbat. Yes, she had cursed the Dauphin with a wax doll. The scribe, sitting calmly in the corner, would have written it all down, his quill scratching on the parchment, recording not the screams, but the neat, orderly narrative of a monster. This was the moment Jeanne de Clavicul truly died. In her place, on that official record, the French Medea was born, a creature crafted from pain, fear, and political necessity. The final act of the tragedy was, as it had to be, a public spectacle. This was the pyre's judgment, the hero's finale, performed before the eager eyes of thousands at the Place de Grève. The day of her execution would have been declared a public holiday, a day of moral cleansing for the city of Paris. The sensory experience for the crowd was one of grim festival. The smell of roasted chestnuts from street vendors mingled with the acrid scent of wood smoke from the unlit pyre. The air buzzed with the murmur of a vast crowd, a restless, inhuman hum of anticipation punctuated by the cries of children and the solemn chanting of a procession of priests. For Jeanne, the journey to the pyre was the final humiliation. She would have been paraded through the streets in a simple shift, her body broken from the tortures, her hair shorn, seated on a cart designed for filth. The same people who might have once sought her out for a healing tonic now hurled insults and refuse at her. This was the theater of state power at its most brutal. The pyre itself, a carefully constructed tower of wood and straw, was not just an instrument of death, it was a pulpit. Before she was tied to the stake, her confession, that lurid, fantastical document created in the depths of the Châtelet, was read aloud for all to hear. It was the official narrative, the story the state wanted to tell. The story of a monstrous witch who had threatened the kingdom. As the torch was put to the kindling, the roar of the crowd would have merged with the roar of the flames. Her last moments were consumed by a sensory assault of intense heat, the stench of her own burning flesh, and the sight of 1,000 faces twisted in a grotesque mask of piety and bloodlust. Her death was not an execution, it was a sacrifice. It was the brutal, fiery seal on the legend they had created, a public exorcism designed to cleanse the sins of the powerful by incinerating the body of the powerless. A life is extinguished in a moment, but a legend, once created, can burn for centuries. The legacy of Jeanne de Clavicul became a conflict of interpretations, a story immediately seized and rewritten by the victors. Her guilt was never in question. It was the foundational myth of the Burgundian party's moral crusade. For chroniclers loyal to John the Fearless, such as Enguerrand de Monstrelet, she was not a woman, but a divine sign of the depravity of the Orléans faction. Her trial and execution were proof that God favored the Burgundian cause. They lovingly detailed the most lurid parts of her forced confession, transforming political propaganda into accepted historical fact. She became a cautionary tale told in the courts of Europe, a warning of the dangers of ambition and unnatural knowledge. For later generations, stripped of its immediate political context, her story morphed and simplified. She became a stock character in the dark folklore of France, an archetype of the female poisoner, the wicked court magician who uses her seductive wiles and dark arts to destroy noble houses from within. Her actual knowledge, her probable brilliance as a chemist and scholar, was completely erased. It was replaced by a caricature of feminine evil, a trope that resonated powerfully in a culture deeply suspicious of powerful women. Her name became synonymous with the darkest of crimes, a convenient shorthand for betrayal of the most unnatural kind. In this way, her personal tragedy was subsumed into a larger cultural myth. She ceased to be a historical person and became a symbol, a testament to the power of narrative to shape the past. The conflict of interpretations was, in the end, no conflict at all. The voice of the victim was silenced by the fire, and the only story that survived was the one written by her executioners. So we return to the core question, the agonizing paradox. Why Medea? Why was this specific, horrifying name, the name of the mythological sorceress who murdered her own children to punish her unfaithful husband, chosen to be her eternal brand? The answer is the final, comprehensive solution to the puzzle of her life, and it is a chilling insight into the psychology of her accusers. She was called Medea, not simply because the plot she was embroiled in may have targeted the king's children. The name was chosen because her very existence and her alleged crime represented a profound betrayal of what her society considered to be the natural order. First, she was a woman who had mastered a man's domain. Her knowledge of science and alchemy was a perversion of the feminine role. A woman was supposed to be a vessel for life, a mother and a wife. Jeanne, with her sterile laboratory and her power over the elements of life and death, was seen as an anti-mother, a figure whose knowledge was inherently unnatural and therefore demonic. Second, she was a commoner who had dared to meddle in the fate of princes. Her alleged attempt to poison royalty was not just murder, it was a form of cosmic treason. It was an attempt by the base material of the world to destroy the pure, divinely ordained gold of the monarchy. It was an alchemical crime in reverse, a turning of gold back into lead. The label Medea was a powerful tool of dehumanization. It lifted her out of the realm of human politics and placed her squarely in the realm of mythology and monstrosity. A political rival, like the Duke of Orléans, could be fought, negotiated with, even assassinated. But a Medea, a force of unnatural, child-killing evil, could only be exorcised. She had to be utterly destroyed, burned from the memory of the world, so that the natural order could be restored. The name was not an accusation. It was a verdict, a theological and political weapon that transformed a messy, inconvenient political crime into a simple, terrifying fable of good versus evil. The saga of Jeanne de Clavicul is more than just a grim tale from a dark century. It is a timeless and universal lesson on the nature of power, knowledge, and the brutal mechanics of history. This is the verdict of history, the philosophical conclusion drawn from the ashes of her pyre. Her life was a devastating illustration of the collision between intellect and brute force. She possessed a brilliant, analytical mind, but she existed in a world governed by superstition and dynastic ambition. She believed she could navigate this world using her wits, but she ultimately learned that in the great Game of Thrones, knowledge is only powerful when it is allied with an army. Her story is also a profound and tragic commentary on female ambition in a world built by and for men. She shattered every convention of her time to achieve a position of influence, only to have that very ambition used as proof of her monstrous nature. Her strength was reframed as witchcraft, her intelligence as cunning, her secrecy as demonic conspiracy. She is a testament to the terrible fate of countless brilliant women throughout history, whose legacies were deliberately distorted and destroyed by the patriarchal systems they challenged. Above all, her story is a stark reminder that history is a narrative constructed by the victor. We know of her almost exclusively through the words of the men who condemned and killed her. Her voice is absent, her true motivations lost to the flames. She exists only as the monster they needed her to be. The universal lesson of her life is a chilling one, that proximity to power is a form of radiation, intoxicating and ultimately lethal to those who are not shielded by noble birth or military might. She was a pawn who, for a brief, brilliant moment, believed she could become a player, and for that hubris, she was sacrificed. Her tragedy warns that the line between being a king's confidant and a king's scapegoat is perilously, fatally thin. The final frame is not the roaring fire or the screaming crowd. The story ends years later, in silence. We are in a forgotten room in the vast, sprawling complex of the Palais de la Cité. Dust motes dance in a single shaft of afternoon light that cuts through a grimy window. The room is a storeroom now, filled with broken furniture and discarded tapestries. But in a dark corner, half hidden behind a stack of old account books, sits a small wooden chest. Its lock is rusted, its hinges stiff. Inside, nestled in a bed of faded, rotting velvet, is a single object. It is an empty glass vial. It is a work of extraordinary craftsmanship, perhaps Venetian, its surface etched with intricate, swirling patterns. The glass is impossibly thin, catching the light with a faint, iridescent sheen. It is a thing of profound beauty and elegance, but it is also a thing of profound menace. It is empty, yet it feels heavy with the ghost of what it once contained. It is a perfect, silent symbol of the woman who once owned it. It represents the duality of her life, the beauty and precision of her science, and the terrible purpose to which it was turned. It is a testament to her brilliant mind, her ambition, her triumphs, and her catastrophic fall. The vial holds nothing, and yet it holds everything. The whispers of treason, the agony of the torture chamber, the roar of the flames. It is the last remnant of a life erased, a final, silent testament to the brilliant, ambitious, and ultimately doomed woman the world was forced to remember only as the French Medea.